Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. We're going through my Penguin classics, one book at a time, from now until the end of the year. And we're in ancient Rome today. We're in a big, strange, epic poem, a 7,000-line epic poem from ancient Rome that may be the strangest epic poem that comes out of the ancient world. It's by Lucretius, and its title in Latin is De Rerum Natura. And the Penguin Classic is the nature of things. The cover of this Penguin Classic is very boring. It's an out-of-focus, close detail of a fresco from a house in Herculaneum. So I have added Superman and the Daily Planet because one of the besetting faults of Penguin Classics, I love them, you know I do, I'm the biggest fan in the world of Penguin Classics, but one of their besetting faults is boring, stupid covers. We didn't see that last time. For some reason, the cover design for the Oresteia was beautiful, a woman with a gauzy mask over her face. It would have been easy to do the same thing here. Easy to do. But instead, the authors decided to do this, I think, probably because the editors at Penguin decided to do this, even though it was kind of boring before I added a Kryptonian. I think probably because some writings connected with Lucretius have been found in a house in Herculaneum, but not in this house, not in the house where this fresco comes from. It's a bad idea because the fresco is never going to convey to the modern eye how glorious it was when it was made and in its own setting. The artwork could be beautiful. The goal for a lot of these Roman frescoes at the time this one was made, which was considerably later than when this poem was written, was verisimilitude. It was to make it look like there was actually sunlight hitting a pitcher of water, like the fruit was actually there. And you're never going to convey that in a blurry detail on a Penguin Classic cover. We're going to see a lot of bad Penguin Classic covers, unfortunately. Seeing it this way, a Roman fresco, always reminds me of that great scene from I, Claudius, the BBC miniseries I, Claudius, where Claudius is consulting with his printers about his gigantic history of Carthage, and he finds when he's looking at the proof sheets of some of the pages, you've got a room full of slaves doing copy work, and he finds that the borders have been decorated with elephants. An obvious allusion to the only Carthaginian that anybody knows, which is Hannibal. And he's outraged, and he says to the master of the shop, "What on earth are these elephants doing here?" And the master of the shop said, "Well, I thought it was fine work. It's diverting to the eye." And Claudius, in a fit, an authorly fit, tells him to remove it, do it all over. The elephants have nothing to do with the story. This is a serious work of history. And then he storms off, and we're left with the shopmaster who says, "We will do this without the elephants and see if anyone reads it." I always think about that when I think about the obvious connections that are made by the people at Penguin who make the cover designs. In this case, for instance, an obvious choice that would have been far more attractive and cheap, every bit as cheap as this, would have been a high definition detail of a microscope on a table. But and the reason why that would be pertinent here to this poem is because this is a long poem about how everything is made of atoms. It's a long poem about the physical makeup of the world. We know virtually nothing about Lucretius, but we do know that people read his work. It's echoed in Catullus. It's echoed in other poets. It's especially echoed in Virgil. Virgil clearly knew this poem well. Cicero mentions it. People knew it. People read it. It's a long and strange work. It's a gigantic epic poem, but it has all the trappings of a standard epic poem. It has an invocation to a goddess at the beginning, in this case Venus. It has gods' metaphors about them, high deeds and stuff like that, are alluded to all throughout. It's in dactylic hexameter, but it has no actual stories of heroism. It's instead a long poetic outline about the way the world works. And it takes that outline from the philosopher Epicurus, who Lucretius venerated. And Lucretius thought that the most effective way to get the ordinary populace to know anything about Epicureanism would be to write it in a poem, especially an evocative poem. And he was right about that. Nobody reads Epicurus. the dude bro, the manosphere section of YouTube does, or at least claims they do. But lots and lots of people have read this poem, and it's been translated many, many times. It's strange, and it has never really done it for me. I think probably because my imprinting was with Homer, and with those squalid moments and those high deeds and that heroism and that sacrifice and whatnot. And there's none of that in here. Instead, this is meant to echo the worldview of Epicurus, which is that worldview, or philosophy, we want to call it that, is probably one of the most traduced and misunderstood philosophies of the ancient world that exists today that we know of. The standard reduction of Epicureanism is eat, drink, and be merry, and that is just as far away from Epicurus as you could get. Epicurus believed in, yes, he believed that humans are motivated by their desires, by their pleasures, and that they should be, and that following that broad middle path of acknowledging your pleasures and pursuing them is the way to a happy life. There's no idea in Epicurus that you need to worry about another life. You're only talking about this life. But I think the reason why Epicureanism has been so popular and so demonized and so debated in the centuries since is because it largely is an articulation of the life philosophy that everybody has, whether they acknowledge it or not, whether they've ever heard the word Epicurus or not. Most people do live like that, where they go along that broad middle path of their own pleasures. I'm not going to do this because I don't like it, and I'm going to do this because I do, within reason. It's a broad middle path because it avoids the upper excess of only consulting your own happiness and nothing else. And most people avoid that. Most people know to avoid that. They know it instinctively. They don't do it. It's part of being communal species. And that broad middle path also avoids the bottom excess, which is to pursue your own pleasures with an intensity that is both myopic and self-destructive. For instance, when it comes to human physiology, now keep in mind, this is not an endorsement, but when it comes to human physiology, there is no greater pleasure that you can have in terms of just specific nerve endings, in terms of just pleasure, without any rationalization, without any larger picture. There's no greater pleasure you can have than a heroin high. And even the people along that broad middle path who know that don't become heroin addicts, because that the excesses are to be avoided. Most people live that way. They follow their pleasures, they follow their happiness as much as they can. And they temper it by making sure that it's neither too high nor too low, making sure that it's not necrophilic, making sure that it's not bitterly self-absorbed. And that kind of Epicureanism is not eat, drink, and be merry, obviously. Actually, this particular Penguin edition has an introduction by Richard Jenkins, and he puts it really well. I want to read you a bit of that. He's talking about the atomic idea of Epicurus, and by extension Lucretius, that the world is moving particles that have agglomerated and whatnot, but nothing more than that, and that's enough. He writes, all events and processes are merely the effects of the movement of atoms. All existence is material. Everything that exists is part of nature, and therefore there can be no supernatural realm. It is disputed in what sense Epicurus believed in the existence of the gods. The usual view is that he believed the gods to exist as independent entities, but some think that he believed them to exist merely as concepts. I think he believed they exist merely as concepts. This much is sure. Insofar as the gods exist, they must be made of atoms like everything else. They did not create the world, they play no part in its governance, and they take no interest in us. Epicurus argues that certain moral truths follow necessarily from these scientific facts. No one can rationally pursue anything other than his own pleasure. Epicurus is thus, in the strict sense, a hedonist. However, he places a fairly low value on pleasure as the man in the streets is likely to conceive it. Hunger, thirst, and sexual desire are necessary appetites, but we should try to moderate them as far as our nature allows. Romantic love, for example, is to be avoided, as it involves a loss of rationality and self-control. All pleasures of the senses are inferior to such abstract pleasures as friendship and philosophical contemplation. Accordingly, this philosophy, often characterized as a religion of sensuous self-indulgence, is in reality rather austere. No one could be less of an epicure than Epicurus. That's really well said, and that is absolutely true, and that you get that in this refracted in this long poem, which is another example. This poem itself is another example, in fact, a far more extreme example of what we mentioned last time about the pitiless ratio of the survival of classic texts, because this De Rerum Natura did not win the Dionysia. It did not win. It was not copied everywhere. It was not transmitted all over the Greek world. It had copies. It was known, but it comes to us through one copy, and one copy of that copy, both of which have vanished, both of which are gone. So our textual provenance for this thing is about as flimsy gets, and you can tell when you read the poem. Even in a smooth translation, an accurate translation will show the roughnesses, the patches and the holes here, where you can definitely tell you're not reading a finished product that came straight from the pen of its author. But it's an amazing reading experience. It's very strange because Lucretius does not have wars in heaven or magical transformations or anything like that to concentrate on. He concentrates on other things, and most of what he concentrates on is daily life. The normal experiences that shore up his points about what things should be important to you. And some of those daily experiences, the feeling that exists in your heart when you hear the mewling of a small puppy or a small kitten, the amazing openness of the reflection of the sky in a puddle in the street. It doesn't look like a puddle. You look inside the reflection and you see the vastness of the sky. The pleasure of being dizzy. The weird, alarming pleasure of being dizzy. And a bunch of other things. A bunch of other very minuscule feelings that exist in our felt life, but that most poets of the ancient world or even the modern world don't really consider worth the time to immortalize. And Lucretius does that over and over again. This is an intensely human poem that lays out a worldview that is not anything like what you will find in Aeschylus or anywhere in Cicero or anywhere in Virgil. Nothing like it at all. The humans in this book are not the playthings of the gods. They are not furtive or ridiculous beings. Instead, the thing that drove people crazy about this book is that it fundamentally removes meaning in italics with a capital M from existence. Now, I myself am of the opinion that it should. And of course, existence only has meaning without italics and without a capital M. It has the meaning we give to it, and that's plenty. It doesn't need anything more than that. And there's no way to demonstrate that it has anything more than that, and that has made this poem disturbing to the many, many people who have translated it into English. And the translation we come to another regular point in your Daily Penguin. One is that pitiless ratio of survival for a lot of these ancient texts. The other is what is the whole question of translation, because you're dealing with Lucretius here in an English language translation, and so you have to talk about that when you're talking about this Penguin classic, not when you're talking about Lucretius just in general, but when you're talking about this Penguin classic, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, what are you getting in this particular Penguin? I think Penguin has had 2 translations of De Rerum Natura, maybe more than 2, but 2 that I know of, and the poem has a long and storied history and translation. One of the interesting things about it, one of the many interesting things about the translation history, is that it was translated in English in its complete length for the first time by a woman centuries ago, which is kind of amazing. And who knows how many times for how many different poems that has been true, and we just don't know about it. But the translation here is by A.E. Stallings, whose name has come up on this channel. She is a fantastic translator. Her Hesiod is not to be missed. And she's also a fine poet. I've read last year her collection of poetry, and it was quite good. And that brings us to her translation of Lucretius. And so, okay, there's a thing about translators. The higher end, more programmatic translators, not the workaday guys and gals, not the workaday ones who are digging into a work that has inspired them for their whole life, but rather a slightly more marquee translator who goes from big project to big project. I don't know if I made that out correctly. There's a world of difference between someone who wants to who has always wanted to translate Beowulf, and a translator who is sort of in the narrow world of literary translating a star, and who goes from book to book to book. There's a world of difference between those two things. And when you get to the latter, when you get to someone who has a program and who has a name, you all of a sudden have to deal with translator decisions that aren't necessarily hospitable to the reader. And that's a very bad thing. The translator exists at the service of the reader, and should never forget that. We mentioned last time John Dryden's idea that the idea of the goal of translating should be not an accurate line-by-line transmogrification of the book, but rather take the book and make it in the translated language, make it live in that language. Which means that you shouldn't play games just to show that you are in the room. You shouldn't be the kind of translator who says, well, Lucretius is fine and good, but don't forget about me. You see that, for instance, with Peviar and Volkonsky, the premier star translating team of the modern era, the premier living star translating team. In their weird decision, they did War and Peace after an entire career of translating great works from Russian. They finally did a War and Peace, a massive brick of a thing that is in many places brilliant. But you can tell you're dealing with star translators because they decided not to translate the French, which goes a long way towards defeating the purpose of translating the book at all. Since it stands to reason in the late 20th, early 21st century that your readers will no more read French than they read Russian. So you're giving them page after page after page after page after page of a language they have to read in the footnotes. That is a very star translator decision to do. You won't find it in someone like Rosemary Edmonds or Constance Garnett. You won't find it in the mid-20th century translators who were serving their readers and not thinking about showboating. And unfortunately, although A.E. Stallings usually doesn't do that, in this translation she does, because she decides to translate Lucretius into 14ers. Those of you who don't know the history of poetic translation or poetry or versification just in general won't know what that is, but it's an abomination of a verse form. It's 14 syllables per line, and that would be bad enough. That defies any kind of reading, silent or out loud. But in addition to that, Stallings decides to do 14ers that are end rhymed, and that doesn't work either, because the whole point of rhyme is that it nails the line. It ties the line to the deck. And with a line as long and disjointed as a 14er, there's no way to do that. With 14ers, the rhythm will inevitably bury the rhyme. So what's the point of doing it? If the ear, either reading or spoken, is never going to get the rhyme unless you make an effort to stress it, then why bother to do it? And the answer to why bothering to do it is not a good one. A.E. Stallings actually has a slight translator preface and says something, let's see here, said something rather indefensible. It might seem crazy in modern times to render 7,400 odd lines of Latin poetry on physics and philosophy into rhyming 14ers. That is indeed crazy. There is no but. You write a line like that and you're the translator, you're naturally setting up a but there is no but for that. That is just crazy. I had no such plan when I set out, but in deciding a decade ago, for a lark, to try my hand at some passages of Lucretius, I stumbled on heptameter as roomy enough to embrace the Latin dactylic hexameter in an almost line-by-line translation. It is certainly that, but that's not the point. fashioning couplets and the occasional triplet out of the original had something of the pleasure of a crossword puzzle, though one to which there were no guaranteed answers. When I was commissioned to complete the poem, it seemed natural to continue as I had begun. And it wasn't. It was unnatural to continue as you'd begun. Plenty a country curate or a country squire all through the last 4 centuries in their country home for an idle hour have tried transforming Lucretius into 14ers. And sure, that has the fun of a crossword puzzle, I guess. It's a metrical kind of fun to see if you can make that work. But the whole thing about that kind of exercise is that it's intensely private. You're not expecting anyone to try and read it. If you get commissioned after you've been doing left-handed exercises like that to translate the whole of Lucretius for not only an audience, but thanks to being a Penguin Classic, a wide audience, it's incumbent on you to change what you're doing, to change it. And A.E. Stallings apparently did not think that. So the translation that we get here, the version of Lucretius that we get here, is weird. And you have to keep that in mind, because that informs the comment that I made last time about why I have duplicates in this little book room. Not just duplicates in the sense of having a Penguin Classic of De Rerum Natura, but also having another De Rerum Natura in some other format, but also having 2 or maybe 3 different Penguin editions of the same work. Translated by different people, introduced by different people, footnoted by different people. That is the reason why, because this is an oddity. It is much more Lucretius by way of Sir Walter Raleigh than it is Lucretius. And I have an example I want to read you. Let's see here. Yes, this is a passage from Book 2, which is, it could be anywhere. I don't want these daily penguins to be too long. So, often it comes to pass that we behold, all grazing on the self-same field of grass, flocks of woolly sheep along with horses bred for battle, under the rent of the sky, the herds of horned cattle, all slaking their thirst at the same stream, yet each remains a separate and distinguishable species, and retains the nature of its parents and behavior of its race, so various is the store of matter lurking in the grass, race and grass, forced to rhyme there, and such the diversity of matter in the stream, and then, furthermore, select from these a single specimen, then and specimen, being forced to rhyme there. It does not work. It simply does not work. And in this case, it does not work for 200 pages. So, the thing that recommends this translation is watching an absolutely first-rate translator enjoy herself in an odd and weird and ill-advised way with a great classic. And this touches on a point that we've made a couple of times already, which is what do you do if you're Penguin Classic and there is a great translation, of an obvious great translation, the obvious great translation of a generation out there? Do you get it? Can you get it, or do you not? And why? Is it because you couldn't afford it? Is it because your editors didn't like it? The Frank Copley translation of De Rerum Natura is the obvious choice here to be a Penguin Classic, and it's not. Because its own translation might not be available for sale. There could be any number of reasons. I'm not faulting Penguin Classic, but the Copley translation is the one to read if you're going to read it in English. This one is not, and that is weird, because Stallings would ordinarily be a translator to recommend. It's just, in this case, I defy anyone to pick up this particular Penguin Classic of De Rerum Natura in 14ers and notice anything about it as a reading experience other than that it's in 14ers. I defy anybody to do that. What difference does it make to a reader who picks this up who has no Latin that those lines are incorporating more of the moving bits and pieces of the original lines in Latin? What difference does it make to them? If the end product in English is so incredibly ungainly, if they don't know the Latin, then they don't know what's missing or what's not. So, your Daily Penguin for today is a bit mixed. Of course you should read on the nature of things, just because it is so incredibly strange to see something like this coming out of the ancient or even the modern world. And when you read it, or before you read it, might do you good to study up on Epicureanism and see what you think of it. It's people who study a life philosophy and then consciously, self-consciously adhere to it are incredibly boring. But thinking about, you already have a life philosophy, and you are constantly at work on it. And that's the way it should be. But thinking about the more formalized tenets of actual formal life philosophies is endlessly interesting and might help you to tweak your own. That is a worthwhile thing to do with Lucretius, and reading his poem is as well. The Jenkins introduction in this volume is really good, and Stallings is a translator to know and to read, but I'm not sure that it's a match made in heaven here. So I'm gonna wrap it up on that ambiguous note. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.